Welcome to the HealthCast Now podcast. Join host Kevin Cottrell as he interviews thought leaders and world-class experts with a focus on demystifying and deconstructing complex health and wellness topics. Each episode has a focus on achieving optimized circadian health and wellness and is designed to provide actionable tips and information that you can apply to your everyday lifestyle. Please remember our disclaimer. The materials and content discussed within the HealthCast Now podcast are the opinions of Kevin Cottrell and or the guests interviewed. This information is intended as general information only for listeners of the podcast. Listeners should always seek professional advice, and the content and opinions expressed on the podcast should never be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Welcome back to another episode of HealthCast Now. I am host Kevin Cottrell. Joining me today on the podcast is Dr. Jack Kruse, neurosurgeon extraordinaire and industry challenger. I've asked Jack to come on and talk to me about 5G, EMF, and the huge inflection point that we're about to hit with the rollout nationwide in markets on 5G. And some context for this, I talk about this on the episode with Jack, is he was way ahead of himself at Paleo Fx in 2012, where he talked about blocking blue light and circadian disruption. And my personal opinion is we're at that same point now with the rollout of 5G from a health and wellness standpoint. Dr. Kruse comes on and he and I talk in this 3-part series about the basis for 5G, why it's a big challenge, and the fact that we should be paying attention to this and how it's going to manifest itself in terms of illnesses, chronic disease, and health and wellness. He does a great job of explaining the why and why he's, as a neurosurgeon, is very concerned about the effects of 5G. And it's not what you're seeing in the scare tactic pieces that are out there on social media. It's not what you see in the common news articles. But for those of you who follow HealthCast Now and believe in circadian biology and optimization and believe in mitochondrial health, you're going to want to dive in deep. The first episode is going to give you some homework. There are several blog posts where before you get into part 2 and part 3, you're probably going to want to stop and listen to them. They will be in the show notes as well. So please stay tuned for my interview with Dr. Jack Kruse. Welcome back to another episode of HealthCast Now. I am host Kevin Cottrell, and joining me today is Dr. Jack Kruse. Welcome to the show, Jack.
Hey, what's going on?
Well, we're going to talk 5G and non-native EMF and a couple of important topics. Before we jump into all that, I want to give listeners that maybe haven't heard one of your other episodes of the numerous times you've been on the podcast a quick backgrounder. Why don't you take a minute and just give them a quick synopsis, because I know it could take a while, but just give them a quick synopsis, and then we'll jump into 5G and the EMF topic.
The easiest synopsis is, as my day job as a neurosurgeon, I'm obviously very interested in neurologic function, brain function, and anytime you talk about the brain, since it and the heart has the highest mitochondrial density of any tissue in the body, I naturally became what I like to call a mitochondriac. And that is a person who focuses solely on some of the special abilities that mitochondria give cells with these organelles inside them. And it turns out the heart and the brain have a lot of them. This has, pretty far-ranging implications, from a biologic perspective. And some of the initial things that Kevin and I talked about and why Kevin asked me to speak in an event that he was part of was I introduced a lot of these concepts utilizing things that people can understand 5, 6, 7 years ago. That specifically being the leptin receptor, the leptin prescription, cold thermogenesis protocols. All of these things are what I would like to call synonyms or proxies for the fundamental actions of electrons and protons and light, at a subatomic level that occurs in this organelle called the mitochondria. And one of the things that I talked to Kevin about in 2011, before I actually went to speak, is that the interaction of all these things together were coming to a head. Back at that time, we were in a 1G world, probably 1 to 2G world. And I made the comment to him when we were in Nashville that there was a coming tsunami wave that nobody really saw that was going to lead to a lot of disease illnesses, and at that time, Kevin and I already knew there were. I mean, diabetes, obesity, were big deals back in 2011, and they still are. Even the way certain autoimmune conditions presented in 2011 were radically different than what my textbooks in medicine said that were published in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And I made comments to him there, and those comments really were predictions that as time went on, I would become less crazy and more, how shall we say, correct, because I believe that the power density changes that man was applying through our use of technology were going to lead to changes in mitochondrial function that would make diseases manifest out of the thin blue air. And if you fast forward to 2018, which is where we are now, and Kevin, I hope you comment on this, is in 2011, when we first met, there was no opiate crisis, was there?
Oh, there absolutely wasn't.
All right. So now we're talking just in the span that we know each other, that here's a crisis that just manifested out of the sheer blue. The other big crisis that hopefully we'll get into that, my theory predicted is that there would be a breakdown or a cognitive de-evolution as man began to assimilate higher power densities through their use of the electromagnetic spectrum to communicate, where it would lead to defects in brain function. Now we know that kids have a major problem with this. We just had a school shooting, another one in Florida that everybody knows about, but nobody has really appropriately linked the real problem. Most people on the left want to talk about the link to guns, and most people on the right don't want to link it to guns, but they have really no idea what it's really linked to. And in my original discussions with Kevin and with a lot of my members, I have made that linkage directly to patents that Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, all the social media platforms use, as well as the news media now, because remember, their screens are no longer analog. They're now digital. They're all LED. These light energies are capable of changing the matter inside our mitochondria to change the way we think, to change the way our moods are, to actually change the biochemistry that occurs in our cells just by changing not only the light frequency, but also diurnal natural patterns of how light frequencies work on Earth. And that generally comes from the sun. Now, most of modern man's problems are related to the changings of these behaviors. And the problem that we now face is no one realizes that as we've changed network capacity in terms of both bandwidth, power density, and now waveform, because that's really what the big issue is for us, is everything. When you take the optic that I have, go back to 1874, when this process really started, and really examine the history of technology from that time to 2018, you will notice as technology has ramped up, modern man has crashed. And this is not a coincidence.
You know what's interesting about this, Jack? And you'll remember the story. You were about to go on the main stage at Paleo Fx, and you made the comment to me. You said, watch this. Everybody thinks they're here for food. And you went out there and you tied in blue light and circadian disruptions. And it was one of the first times in a broad audience that you had an opportunity to do that. And it was disruptive and not accepted at first. And I bring this up because I really see that we're at this inflection point again. In other words, your predictions, because you're always out ahead of this stuff, are coming to fruition, in this case on non-native EMF and 5G. And I would expect, because of 5G and what we're going to talk about today, that the rapidity and the speed at which this becomes front and center is going to be much quicker. In other words, 5G is, as we're going to talk about, is so intense that right now you can walk around and you can buy blue blockers and put things on your computer and do all sorts of things, and people are much more aware of it, right?
What you just said is absolutely true, but I got a funny feeling that the goal of this podcast is going to be substantially different than almost any other podcast I've probably done, because I know what you want to talk about. And I've told you even before we started recording that this is going to be a very difficult topic for a lot of different people, because if you really don't have the foundations down, you may get lost. But the prediction, as Kevin said, in 2011, blue light was the number one non-native EMF issue in a 1G to 2G world. And what people do not realize, that as we have progressed from, say, 0.2G when The Wizard of Oz was made in 1939 to where we are right now, we have changed literally billions of fold in terms of power density. And Kevin just made the point that the rapidity of the change that we're getting ready to face as a species is going to be extremely rapid. And the point that I want to make to everybody before we get into this is that's the reason why in 2011 we didn't have an opiate crisis. That's the reason in 2018 we do. It can happen that fast. It's also, to use another disease, because I want to make sure people understand this. In 2011, we still had school shootings. Most people remember the first one was in 1999. What people don't realize, though, is if you look at the chronology and how, I want to say, mean-spirited they are, almost to the point where it doesn't appear that there's a soul, you'll notice that when I say, I'm using these terms on purpose, this kid like Nicholas Kruse that just shot all these kids up, he really did not have any introspection at all to understand what he did. And the interesting thing is, not only was he mentally ill, but he had autism. Autism predetermined his mental illness, and autism happens to be another one of these diseases that showed up. 50 years ago, there was no autism. I don't want to say no autism, but it was really described in 1940 when we only had, that 0.2G to 0.5G network, which was mostly RF radiations and incandescent bulbs. But the thing is, autism in the last 50 years has gone, the best numbers we have from the CDC is 1 in 100,000 live births. Today, it's now 1 in 34 live male births in Orange County. And this parallels the absolute growth of the 5G networks. And what people really don't understand is that in all of our communities, all different cities, all different zip codes we live in, the rollout of the network is not the same. And that's the reason why these disease metrics look so different in different zip codes. And it's something that in my profession, they know it's occurring, but no one really understands why it's happening. And that's the reason why, with my members, and probably when we have this discussion, people will begin to understand why I'm a big stickler about your zip code and where you live and when you need to go. There's certain places that you're going to see the effect of network changes much quicker. I mean, obviously there are some biologic issues tied to your genome and your SNPs and all that stuff that make you more susceptible, but most humans can tolerate the inflection point that we're up to right now. I made a prediction recently to my own members, when our economy is fully 5G, tied in with both IT and the Internet of Things, when everything is connected by RFID chips, diabetes and obesity will be the norm. In fact, it's going to be the way that you adapt to a 5G network. There is no way that you're going to be able to maintain some of the things that we are able to maintain now in our population and still do it well. And for people that think this is hyperbole, there's 2 data points that I'd like to point to that will show you that my perception certainly is not the majority, but that my perception may be very spot on. The U.S. military cannot form a normal army anymore because it can't find enough fit people in the United States in order to have, the standards that they had just in 1980, 1990, and even 2000. And this recently came out in the last 2 weeks. The second data point that I'd like to point out to people is I made a prediction to my members 5 or 6 years ago that with time, it will be shown that longevity in cities will begin to drop in the epidemiologic studies that not only scientists do, but also the government does. So just in the last 6 months, all the major news networks, you can Google search this yourself, Fox, NBC, CNN, the major 20 big cities in the United States for the last 2 years, in 2016 and 2017, have faced for the first time in recorded human history that longevity has dropped in cities. And nobody knows why. Why? Because if you read the prediction of power scaling laws, and actually, believe it or not, there's a book that actually is published about this. I think the guy's name is West. The name of the book is called Scale. He talks about mathematical power scaling laws making the prediction that humans would do better in terms of longevity by living in big cities. That was absolutely true all the way up until 2016. And then suddenly it's changed. Nobody out there made the prediction, at least that I know of, that I did to my members, that living in a city we'd hit an inflection point. I thought the inflection point back when I made the prediction would be when we got to 5G. It turned out I was wrong. It started to happen when we went from 3G to 4G and then into 4G. I've subsequently found out the reason why, because within the 4G engineering principles that engineers had to use, they really had to do a lot of crazy things to not only the power density, but also the waveforms in order to deliver the bandwidth that modern humans want in their tech devices. And you have to realize these engineers are very creative people. They have proven beyond a shadow of a doubt many of my beliefs about light, because these guys truly are light engineers that use the nonlinear properties in light in order to do things that astound us. And we get astounded by them because we have them in our cell phones. You actually have the power of the world at your fingers when you have a cell phone, but nobody realizes that progressive technology has some serious biologic components to it, that what I call a toll. And those tolls are found in our modern Neolithic diseases. Most of the people that Kevin is going to talk to on his podcast, or that I interact with, believe that those changes are tied to both food and exercise, and the fact that our food is no longer real food, it's fake food. There is some truth to what they say. That effect is so small when you understand the effects of light, and then when you really understand that food fundamentally is a story that's tied to light, because the entire food web on this planet is built around photosynthesis, which only deals with the visible spectrum of light, which only goes between 250 and 780 nanometers. The frequencies that we're talking about between a 0.2G and a 5G network span about 1/3 of the electromagnetic spectrum. And the funny thing is, when I talk about this stuff, because it is really complicated stuff, most people understand the high end of the electromagnetic spectrum really well. For example, if I told somebody, hey, here's an X-ray machine, I want you to stand in front of it for 2 hours, everybody on this planet would say, no, I don't think I'll do that. Because they have the implicit understanding that X-rays in the ionizing part of the spectrum are no bueno for our cells. What people don't understand is that the exact same thing is true on the lower end of the spectrum, where this 0.2G through 5G network is. The only difference is the time scale. See, X-rays will make you really sick in shorter time scales. So if we take, for example, say a nuclear explosion at Hiroshima or Nagasaki, a lot of those people died within the first 3 years of exposure. Well, what people are not realizing right now is we've now had about 50 years of exposure to both RF and microwave devices. The diseases that we are now seeing in medicine are a function of that environmental exposure that we've put into our ionosphere around us. And the problem is that's because the time scale is so stretched out. That's the reason why people don't have my perspective. And the other problem is that industry that makes these devices that people have become addicted to. They've taken a page out of the tobacco litigation. They've paid scientists to do studies, control their methodologies to study the radiation frequencies in such a way that the effect will never truly be found. And the reason why that's easy to do, it's much easier to do with EMFs than it is with tobacco, because light functionally is a nonlinear physical property in life. That means that small little changes in it can lead to seismic changes down the road. And most people have probably heard the effect called a butterfly effect. The butterfly effect is a nonlinear effect. But when you begin to realize that if you tweak the methodology of the way you study things in any way, you can bury the effect. And when you publish that in journals, because you have a lot of money in which to do this, you're creating, how shall I say, disinformation into the scientific literature, much the same way that, if any of you are listening to the news right now about what's gone on between the Republicans and the Democrats, is we've had a narrative for 1 year that, the Republicans and our president have colluded with the Russians. Now we're starting to find out it's exactly the opposite. And I would tell you that the data in non-native EMF is really a really good parallel to this story. And the irony is, the reason why this story has occurred, in my view, in the political arena, is because both sides have actually, they know to use light waves through blue screen devices that emit RF and microwave radiation to change the opinions of people that connect to this network this way. And the problem is, most of the people listening to this podcast don't even realize that this wireless connection is massive until I stop them and I point out, like I did to Kevin before we got on this podcast, that when you begin to realize that's really what happens between the sun and a leaf. The wireless communication between a sun and a leaf is light. And that communication has the information and energy built into it to take carbon dioxide and water, combine the two to make sugar. And this happens below our level of perception, much in the same way that blue light, RF, and microwaves occur below our perception to change the way we think, to change the metabolism in our brain, to change the way dopamine works, to change the way many neurotransmitters work, the way many proteins work. And when you say it without fully explaining it and having all the different perspectives that you really need, that's how in 2011, when Kevin asked me to talk to the guys at Paleo Fx, back then they thought I was absolutely batshit crazy. Why? Because they didn't have the perspective that I just gave you in the first 20 minutes of this podcast.
Jack, before we jump in, I just want to, because we're going to have this be a lot more in-depth here in a minute. You and I, before we started recording, wanted to give people some homework, right? So if somebody's listening to this now, I want to run through sort of your suggestion on a couple of your blog posts and a webinar for people that say, this is important enough to me. I want to get a good grounding in this before I listen to the rest of this. What is your suggestion on a couple of posts? And I will have these linked in the show notes as well.
Well, the first one that is about blue light, because I think we can go through that one. That's one we didn't talk about. I would tell you that's the Ubiquination 4, 5, and 6 blog posts. The one that actually gets to the real meat of the issue, that would be the Time 24 and Time 25 blog post. The one that's the whole shot, the one that is really going to be above most people's heads, because it's even above the heads of my members, that would be the April 2016 webinar. But in that webinar, I basically lay the case out of exactly what the mechanism is in the mitochondria that's being disrupted by our use of technology. And it turns out, to describe it to you right here simply, our cells are made of things called topologic insulators. And topologic insulators have a lot of unique abilities that you can read about in those blogs. I really don't want to get into it in the podcast because we'll spend an enormous amount of time talking about it. But the topology, in other words, the surface of things controls the size and shape of things, not only on the surface, but deep below it. That's the reason why that light frequencies can change the size and shape of things. And anytime we change the size and shape of things in anything in the world, that's the study of thermodynamics. And thermodynamics gets right really to the crux of why people who believe the calories in and calories out theory is true versus those who don't. I happen to be the one that does not believe that. And the reason for that is we've always believed when we talk about food and exercise that calories in equals calories out. That's only operational for a closed thermodynamic system. And when I say closed, I mean that there's no input from the outside. Well, we already just talked about how that's ludicrous because in, let's say, a leaf in a plant, its thermodynamics is completely tied to the sun, which is outside of the planetary system. So that's the fundamental reason why I don't believe calories in, calories out. It does have some ideas tied to that theory that actually are operational and useful from a classical sense. But the real issue is that the way we work, the topology of us, fundamentally is a quantum thermodynamic system. And here's where your head really is going to hurt. Quantum thermodynamics is the science that's being built in the last 10 years that talk about energy transfer or transmutation and also information theory. And when I say information theory, I want to be very clear on this. It's how information is passed between things in the universe. And the science that has really brought this to the forefront, there's a guy named Ralph Landauer who's big in Silicon Valley for quantum computing. And information theory really didn't come out of biology. It came out of quantum computation. It turns out now, in the last 10 years, we now have many physicists who are becoming biophysicists, kind of like I am, and beginning to realize that one of the crazy things that life can do is it can not only account for energy, which is classically what I've taught people in the leptin prescription, that the leptin receptor is an electron accountant in your hypothalamus. But it turns out the single most important part of the story is something I haven't spent a lot of time talking about yet, but it's how cells, and specifically mitochondria in cells, actually collect information about the environment through the use of electron spin, electron power from the photons they have. But here's the big one that everybody's now talking about in the paleosphere and the blogosphere, which is this deuterium issue. And people don't realize that deuterium is a proton. I should say it's an isotope of a proton of hydrogen, but it has a different quantum spin number. And these things that are in our cells called the topologic insulators, they deal with a specific part of matter called spintronics. And spintronics is the study of electron spin and proton spin. And to really understand why Jack Kruse has made the predictions that I have made on my doctor Facebook page, in the groups that you've probably seen me, has to do with this study of spintronics. And it turns out how mitochondria change the spin of electrons. And just so we're clear here, Kevin, what is that in English that you guys would understand? That's actually free radical biology. Okay? Free radicals have valence electrons that are singled up, and it turns out not only do mitochondria make them, but they also can alter their spins. What's the other side of the story? The other side of the story is proton spin is a story between H+, which is a proton without an electron, and the other quantum spin number is deuterium. Deuterium is a proton with a neutron that has a different quantum spin. And it turns out mitochondria don't really like deuterium. But it turns out cells do like deuterium in certain places. In other words, the topology inside a cell has very specific quantum thermodynamic laws that determine where it should be and where it shouldn't be. And the crazy part is the time of where it should be is also extremely important. And that's the reason why I made the comment in 2011 when Kevin met me that I told him the single most important thing in biology is circadian biology. And the reason why is because circadian biology determines the quantum spin number of both electrons and protons. And that is the fundamental reasons why what's happening in technology, in our networks, needs to be understood fully by people who truly want to be mitochondriacs going forward. Because if you don't understand how these threads in the quilt of life link between the sun and our mitochondria, you will absolutely never be able to understand why kids are shooting each other in schools. You'll never be able to understand why we have an opiate crisis that's going to get bigger no matter what we do. Why we have cities in Australia that have BMIs, over 40. Why people in Australia have melanoma, but yet we don't see the same problem in the United States. These things are all tied together. I'd even tell you the things that are well known in our country. Why is the stroke belt in the southeast of the United States? The answer to these questions all tie back to the topology in the mitochondria and actually how they interact with the electromagnetic spectrum that we allow in our environment through the choices that we make and the way we interact with technology. And trust me, when you don't understand this, which most of you who are listening to this, I think don't, that's why in 2011, I seemed to those guys at Paleo Fx to be a really crazy guy. And as time goes on, I've made the comment in many podcasts that I'm going to become less and less crazy because guess what? As you all see this unfold in front of your eyes, you're going to look to your experts in medicine, at the NIH, researchers, and they are not going to be able to explain to you why these things are happening. But yet, when you read my Patreon blogs, when you read some of the posts that I put on Facebook, when you see what's going on in the world around you with people having DVTs and heart attacks on airplane flights who were previously healthy, or when a CrossFit athlete who looks like Adonis breaks his back by lifting weights, or when a linebacker from the Pittsburgh Steelers hits his head weird, but yet fractures his thoracolumbar spine, which makes no sense at all unless you understand the things that are going on here. And Kevin, last thing before I let you in here, I want everybody to realize just how far-reaching this is. The school shootings are tied to this. But for those of you who are sports fans, all you have to do is look at the NBA injuries, the NFL injuries, and the fact that we used to have guys like Tom Seaver and Roger Clemens in baseball that could go out and throw 300, 350 innings, strike out 300 to 350 people a year. These days, most starting pitchers in the Major League Baseball can't even go 5 innings. Why is that? Ask yourself, what is it in the last 50 years that has radically changed human capabilities? Why is it that we can still perform really well when we're young, but we seem to fall apart as soon as we hit 30 or 40 years old? It's almost just like that old movie we used to have, Logan's Run. And all of these things that we're talking about right now, these are predictions that I made 5, 6, 7 years ago that these were going to happen. The predictions I'm making now are probably even more dire. And that's really what Kevin wanted to talk about. He wanted to talk about this 5G. When we get to 5G, we are going to see massive changes. And those changes are going to be felt by the people listening to this podcast first. And they're going to seek care and instruction from their so-called experts in functional medicine, chiropractic care, allopathic medicine. And I am going to tell you that what they bring to the table, whether it be a supplement, a prescription pad, you name it, it's going to absolutely fail until you understand that what controls the topology inside your mitochondria is the light frequencies around you.
Stay tuned for part 2 of my interview with Dr. Jack Kruse. Thank you for listening to the latest episode of the Healthcast Now podcast. We hope that you enjoyed this episode and will visit us on iTunes and like and rate this episode and give us some feedback on the content. You can also subscribe to Healthcast Now on iTunes to ensure you never miss an episode. We value your opinion and input. We'd love to hear from you regarding Healthcast Now and how much you're enjoying the content. You can write a review and let us know what you think. For show notes and additional resources related to this or any other Healthcast Now episode, please visit our podcast website, www.healthcastnow.com. We look forward to having you join us again on the next episode of Healthcast Now.